December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
60 years ago today, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed America and the world forever. Athletes, like millions of others, went off to war. 14 players from one college football team would not return.
That was a devastating time for all of us.
All these young men had sacrificed their lives for their country.
For Allied prisoners inside a German POW camp, sports was more than a game. It was the path to freedom.
One of the guards stumbled into the hole and raised the alarm.
The idea of using sports activities to camouflage their work is ingenious.
Behind barbed wire in this country, Japanese Americans still found pride in the national pastime.
They took everything away that was all-American, yet they didn't take away the all-American sport.
In a time of war, sports mattered in extraordinary ways. Tonight, outside the lines, World War II, fields of play, fields of battle. With the nation again at war, we've seen sports as a place for Americans to express grief and patriotism, and as an important beacon of the home front for the troops overseas. Here in New York, just 2 miles from the site of the World Trade Center, we are aboard the USS Intrepid. This aircraft carrier served in both World War II and Vietnam. She is a reminder of the incalculable sacrifices made by America's men and women in uniform. Sacrifices such as those made 60 years ago when many of the men playing football at Montana State went off to war. 14 members of that one team died in service to their country. Their story shines a light so vividly on both the cruelty of such a conflict and the selfless commitment required to protect liberty for a nation at war.
I'd like to tell you the story of a team of heroes. They comprise the Montana State College football team of 1940 and 1941. To the best of my knowledge, no other school has lost its entire football team in this war. Let us add the names of these golden bobcats to the list of our honored dead.
2 months after the end of World War II, in October of 1945, Tom Harmon, one of the nation's leading sportscasters, related the story of the incredible sacrifices made by the members of the Montana State football team.
You don't have to be around very long to hear what this 1941 team was about. Its effect on the school, its effect on its student body, its peers, and its effect on the football program.
It was a selection of guys, all from the Montana Prairie, all with similar backgrounds, agricultural, mining, very, very blue-collar backgrounds. After Pearl Harbor, these guys knew that there was a job to do. There was a bigger game coming up, and they wanted to be in it.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I remember going to school that morning, and the boys, if they'd see a boy and a girl who were sweethearts at school, you know, they'd say, well, you better kiss her goodbye, we're going to war.
My wife and I went over and sat down and listened to the report coming over the radio, and we were kind of shook and didn't know what we would do. But we did know that we'd have to do something, and it would change our way of life from then on.
World War II changed many lives in Montana. The state sent nearly 66,000 people to serve in uniform. 1,500 were killed in action, a death rate second only to New Mexico.
In rural America, patriotism is never far beneath the surface. People in this state are really driven by a sense of place, a sense of pride and love for country.
The patriotic pride that Montanans have. They're not going to throw the first punch, but they'll finish the fight.
Before America entered the war, there were 1,700 students at Montana State College. Within 2 years, that number was cut in half, and the football team was nearly as decimated.
Anybody that goes out for athletics would be a pretty good prospect for being in an Army because they know how to scrap and how to work together.
So many Montana State players actually ended up on the front lines. These guys were healthy. They were farm boys. They were baptized under fire by playing football, and they knew how to make decisions on the run.
It's dark as a dungeon and damp as the dew, where danger is double and pleasures are few, where the rain never falls and the sun never shines. It's dark as a dungeon way down in the mine.
Montana State fullback Bill Zupan grew up in Centerville, a rugged mining town in a part of the state locals call the Gulch.
The Gulch is a unique hunk of geography outside of Great Falls. It's a bald, raw piece of country. Guys would be killed in the mines every day. They survived together in this country with this lifestyle. It was akin to a war camaraderie.
Orrin Beller was a running back from the tiny town of Victor, where he was also a high school letterman in track and basketball.
I can remember seeing him shooting down the floor with the basketball, driving in for a layup. He taught me how to wrestle and fight and take care of myself. When I was little, I just never saw enough of him.
Bernard Clusen played guard. He was the youngest of 12 children from a high school graduating class of only 10 students.
Bernard Clusen was another prototypical All-American boy, a fencing champion, track star, probably picked up football as a second or third interest.
It would have been certainly a big challenge to attend college from a small school like that and be able to make the team as he did.
Bernard Clusen, Orrin Beller, and Bill Zupan left their hometowns for what was relatively rare at that time in the Northern Rockies, a college education. Like all Montana State male students, they were required to serve 2 years in the Reserve Officers Training Corps.
Not a lot of them had any idea they'd have a military future, but it was the means to an end.
That's basically what we were looking for, make a little money that way and spend some time in the Army and then come out and do civilian stuff.
World War II turned those dreams to dust. By the fall of 1940, call-ups of ROTC students were depleting college football teams throughout America. In that year alone, Montana State saw 16 players enter the service. The school's choice was to either drop the sport or field a squad of just 33 players.
We played both offense and defense, and it got to be a pretty tough game. Usually you didn't have enough men to substitute the way you should.
The Montana State Bobcats opened their 1940 season with a 12-0 victory over Western State. But playing only 3 days later, they were shut out by San Jose, 32-0.
Then we got on the train and went to Des Moines, Iowa to play Drake.
Montana State players limped off the field following the 54-0 loss. There was only 15 players that made the trip for that game.
Tumultuous as the season was, Montana State managed a 4-4 record. The next season, 1941, military induction continued to claim Bobcat players. The team had but one victory in its first 4 games, heading into a late October meeting with its arch rival, the University of Montana. The underdogs from Bozeman took a 13-0 lead into the locker room. But in the second half, the Grizzlies, behind a deep bench, scored 3 touchdowns to win 23-13.
The 1941 team was the first Bobcat team in 9 years to even score against its arch rival.
We always figured we were pretty good, but we couldn't beat the University of Montana.
The Bobcats would not win another game. On November 22, 1941, they ended their season with a 39-0 loss to Idaho. For many of the players, it was the final college football game they would ever play. In 15 days, Pearl Harbor would change their lives forever.
Outside the Lines, World War II, Fields of Play, Fields of Battle is presented by State Farm Insurance. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked America to a war footing. Hundreds of thousands of ROTC students were mobilized to active duty. And so at Montana State, Dana Bradford and William Coey were the first Bobcat players inducted. They entered the Army Air Corps for flight training. They were soon joined by Joe McKeever and Jack Burke, each young man leaving behind football to face an uncertain future.
Montana people aren't real happy to go to war, but yet when something comes up, it seems like they serve with a positive attitude, that everything's going to be okay.
We figured it was a job that had to be done, and we did it. That's all. Signed up, and whatever branch we could get into or wanted to get into, might as well go now and get it over with.
One by one, they went off. Some of them, you never saw them again. Gradually, the community had just lost a good proportion of its population, and it was the young men who were gone.
Early in 1942, Bernard Clusen was ordered to active duty and commissioned a lieutenant in the Marine Corps. He was assigned to flight training.
Once he started to fly, he told my father that that's what he wanted to do. He says, once you're up there, he says, you never want to do anything else.
A large number of them went to the Air Corps because that's the most glamorous job in the service, is being a fighter pilot. They all thought of themselves as the swaggering, swashbuckling characters that you'd see in the movies of that era.
By the fall of 1942, Wendell Scavin, Newell Berg, and Bill Zupan were also on active duty. Zupan left school as a sophomore and became a lieutenant in the Army Infantry.
He was 22 or 23, something like that, and in charge of the lives of these other men. Most 22 or 3-year-olds I know now are barely off their skateboards, and here were these men flying planes and leading men into battle.
You don't think you're ever going to die. I know that I didn't until I got very close to it. Then I said, well, wait a minute.
Bill Zupan was one of 4 brothers in uniform. His brother Al had been a star running back at Montana State in the late 1930s. 1 week after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Al was married and reported for active duty.
Al Zupan was the prototypical All-American athlete, the standout football player who they give the ball to whenever everyone else is tired and nobody could carry the ball anymore.
I idolized him. Of course, I wanted to emulate him as much as I could. He had a chance to go play for the Cleveland Browns. Al did not accept that. He got a job as a coach and teacher at Butte Central, which was a good position.
Orrin Beller, the running back from the tiny town of Victor, never settled into a career. He graduated in the spring of 1943 and within 4 months was training as an Army officer at Fort Benning, Georgia.
The job of a second lieutenant was a leadership on the front lines. It was very hard on all of us. We were afraid that something might happen to him.
In early 1944, Beller became the last of the ill-fated Bobcats commissioned an officer. By then, all of the remaining players were in the service. Carl Fye, John Phelan, John Hall, Rick Roman, and Alton Zempel. Later, the stories of their sacrifice and that of their Montana State teammates. In Europe, behind the barbed wire of Hitler's prisoner of war camps, Allied airmen awaited their fate, finding some small pleasure in sport and even the seeds of an escape. That story when we continue. With a casualty rate of well over 50%, few operations in World War II were more dangerous than flying Allied missions over Europe. Tens of thousands of American and British airmen were taken prisoner after being shot down by the Germans. Under the Geneva Convention, POW officers could not be required to work, so that left time, and plenty of it, for athletics.
The airplane was so badly shot up that the pilot lost control of the rudders and gave us the bailout signal.
I got the hatch open, jumped and pulled the ripcord at the same time, and the chute opened.
And the one thought in my mind was, how could there be a war going on when everything around was so quiet?
It was so still that I just couldn't imagine that 2 or 3 minutes before that I had been in all that racket up there.
The parachute caught in the top of the pine trees, and I tried to climb down, and I did well for about 2 little shinnies, and then I fell the rest of the way down to the ground.
I landed in a tree, and I was so cold that I had to sit there for about 30 minutes before I was able to unbuckle my parachute harness.
Dutch dairy workers came along the road. They saw me, they hauled me up out of the ditch. They were taking me to meet the Germans.
And one young girl said, "For you, the war is over."
We went by train to Frankfurt, from there to Oberursel, which was the interrogation center.
A policeman was the first interrogator, and when I wouldn't give anything more than name, rank, and serial number, he grabbed me by the throat, and I pushed him away, and about 5 people descended on me. I thought that they were going to shoot me.
Prisoners of Hitler's Third Reich, Allied POWs created a routine for their survival. Their lifeblood was in their food parcels, letters from home, medical supplies, and sports equipment. Nearly 2 million such items arrived at POW camps from the YMCA through the International Red Cross.
Packs of playing cards, sets of chess, draughts, dominoes, and other indoor games, as well as equipment for outdoor sports, are dispatched to all the camps for the general use of the prisoners.
The International Red Cross recognized, I believe, that sport was a very important factor in keeping up our morale.
They furnished us with practically anything you want at that time in the athletic line, such as basketballs, baseball gloves.
There are tales of incoming prisoners at the front gate being met by reception committees from various barracks, being quizzed about their abilities in various sports. If you look at some of the camp newspapers, there are allegations that some barracks were smuggling ball players in to pad their rosters.
They played from morning till night. The sports field would be occupied 7 days a week during proper weather.
Even when the weather turned cold, POWs found ways to compete.
1941 was a very bad winter. The temperature went down to -40 degrees, and the Germans allowed us to flood the top of the soccer pitch to make a skating rink. Compared to the Canadians, we were hopeless at it.
We wanted to skate the next winter, and the Germans had confiscated our skates, saying that we could use them as a weapon, and we didn't like that a bit. The main thing in a prisoner of war camp is to keep yourself busy. Once you give yourself too much time to think about incarceration, then you're in trouble.
Idleness was driving us crazy. If we had any chance to get into the game, we would get into the game.
All the energy of these young men has got to be used up somewhere. It was much better to let it explode on the sports field.
You felt a little elevated when you scored. It took a lot off your mind.
If you're occupied on a basketball court or on a volleyball court, you weren't thinking about how big that steak was back home that you were eating.
Boxing was one of the main sports which people used to indulge in.
There were occasions where they would pit an American against, say, a British boxer.
The traditional British style of boxing is to stand absolutely upright in front of your opponent and to box him, whereas the American style was like Jack Dempsey, and they would really fight rather than box.
We had the ring all set up. The whole thing was lined with prisoners sitting around watching them.
We had about 8 bouts. And if my memory serves me right, the Americans won nearly all those bouts.
Some of the British flyers had been in prison since 1940. They eagerly awaited an annual event, a familiar rite of their homeland, Sports Day.
All schools in Britain have a sports day once a year.
The Germans encouraged the sports days because they were able to take propaganda photographs. There are whole sets of photographs taken that show sports days, from swimming events to model boats being made.
Sports Day had all the track events that you'd expect: 100 yards, 440 yards, the mile.
We had a proper start with a gun, just fired blanks, and we had a tape at the end to break, the normal sort of Olympic standards.
In a very real sense, they were reestablishing their sense of prestige, their position among their fellow prisoners by their prowess.
Diary entry, 2nd Lieutenant Ernest Chumley. The fellows on the team are all a bunch I'd like to remember. They are Hank, Junior, Swoon, Mac, Auk, Pat, Doc, Les, and myself. A swell bunch of screwballs.
You're not going to get mom and apple pie, but you can have baseball. They had organized leagues and would have a World Series to determine the championship of the camp.
Softball was one of their favorite sports, as opposed to baseball, and that was partly driven by the constraints of the playing field. It was quite small. You could easily hit a baseball well beyond where you could retrieve it.
Right around the entire camp was a warning wire, a very short wire about a foot from the ground and 15 feet from the heavy barbed wire. And we are told at the very, very beginning that we neither touched that wire nor went beyond it at risk of death. We had to stand and wait for a roaming guard to come around and pick up the ball, give it back to us.
Everything stopped until we made sure we weren't going to be shot at.
This big Australian guy came up and he whacked the ball very hard towards the warning fence. I jumped up in there and held my hands up like that, and it just smacked into the hand. That was the only time in all my games that I got a round of applause. But it was fear that did it rather than being athletic, I reckon, you know.
6,000 miles from German stalags throughout the western United States, another group of people found small wartime joys in playing baseball. Japanese Americans behind barbed wire, their story is ahead. But next, how some POWs use sport for more than recreation. They used it to escape.
Recollection of 2nd Lieutenant William Capacey. We spent a lot of time playing sports while in Stalag Luft 3. One of the main reasons was to get rid of the sand in our pockets from digging the tunnels.
If a prisoner could escape, he was expected to do so, and it became a battle of wits. And oftentimes the Germans would even reward that. When they discovered these tunneling efforts, they would say, "Better luck next time." It was understood to be an honorable pursuit.
In June of 1943, one of the most daring escapes of the war was being plotted. In the east compound of Stalag Luft 3, near the city of Zagen, 100 miles from Berlin, 3 British officers were planning an escape through a tunnel dug under the camouflage of a gymnastics horse.
Tunnels have been tried from all over the place, under this hut, under this latrine, under this stove. but never out in the open. This was an escape with a difference. The wooden horse was to be taken out 40 yards from the wire, and the hole was to be started under the horse.
The idea of using sports activities to camouflage their work was ingenious.
It was part of a deadly serious cat-and-mouse game between the POWs and their captors. The Germans had already sealed dozens of abandoned tunnels in the camp. They believed Stalag Luft III to be escape-proof. But the prisoners' escape committee authorized this plan if they could build a horse of exactly the right size and durability.
They had to build a horse that was strong enough to withstand us chaps vaulting over it.
My dad was responsible for the design. There was nothing to go on. I mean, nobody had built one before.
The main timbers were roofing joists taken from a shell block that was being built in the east compound, acquired, as it were.
The sides were made of Red Cross boxes. The top of the horse was padded to ensure that it would be easier to vault over and to do all sorts of gymnastic tricks.
Each morning, prisoners carried the horse from the barber shop to the middle of the compound. Hidden inside was a tunneler who was digging for hours, concealing the sand inside the horse, sand that other prisoners would later disperse around the camp. At day's end, the tunneler would place a plank over the hole in the ground and cover that with sand. All the while, POWs were vaulting tirelessly.
We had to vault for 2.5 hours until they'd finished their tunneling. It was difficult in that soft sand without the proper clothing, and it was difficult through lack of food.
I had previous training in gymnastics. My job was to organize a team and to put these people through the various maneuvers.
Among the Germans watching closely were the ferrets, guards assigned to detect escape tunnels. Early on, the POWs decided to deliberately knock over their horse.
This, of course, showed the ferrets there was nothing up our sleeves. The guards had plenty to see and plenty to laugh about.
They expected to be tunneling for maybe a month. After 2 months, they'd only achieved 40 foot.
They were still 70 feet short of the barbed wire. To put a second tunneler to work, the POWs began hauling out the horse several times a day.
The problem was that we couldn't carry 2 men plus sand. From that time on, we had to have a 1.5 hour vaulting session in the evening to recover the sand.
Meanwhile, teams of prisoners were tasked with forging passports and mapping escape routes. Others bartered with guards, cigarettes and chocolate in exchange for compasses and railroad schedules. The tunnelers were nearing the fence. Above ground, lookouts were stepping up their vigilance.
Towards the end, when we were dispersing the sand, it was going under the barber shop, and I was playing my violin all the time, watching my mate who was standing near the barbed wire.
There were individuals who were stationed at different strategic points to keep track of where the Germans were.
If my mate put his hat on, that meant there was a ferret coming. And the floorball would be put down in its usual position, and they'd all gather around me and they'd sing to the accompaniment of my violin.
The escape was scheduled for October 29, 1943. In the morning, the first officer was sealed inside the horse and entered the tunnel. Later that day, 2 more followed, and all 3 made their way outside the camp.
Around 9:30 in the night, one of the guards walking outside with a dog stumbled into the hole, and he raised the alarm.
To conceal the escape, the prisoners cut off the electric lights in their barracks, creating havoc with nighttime roll call. The next morning, they continued frustrating the Germans' attempt to gauge the scope of the escape using a single soccer ball.
We were falling in to be counted. They suspected that some were missing. They didn't know how many.
There was a guard with a table with all these identification cards in it.
Suddenly, a soccer ball appeared, and one of the players kicked it with deadly accuracy that it hit the table, knocked over all the documents. This was followed by a rush of people.
And the major shouted out, "Arrest that ball!" And in protest, the major reported that there was mutiny afoot.
They called a troop of Germans in, and they had machine guns, and they started firing off.
Any movement was immediately punished. 2 of our chaps sat down to play a game of chess, and they were taken off to the cooler.
But the disruptive tactics worked. Officers Michael Cotner, Eric Williams, and Oliver Philpott escaped Stalag Luft III.
Oliver Philpott went off in smart suit as a businessman, and the other two went in untidy suits made out of blankets.
It's the only escape of its kind that all three participants actually got back to England.
Diary entry. 2nd Lieutenant Bruce Bachstadts. April 3rd, 1945. Max Schmeling showed up in camp dressed in very natty civilian clothes. Several of the boys had him autograph pictures, which a very handy press agent passed out. He acted very friendly.
Max Schmeling was an athlete as well known to Americans as to Germans. When the heavyweight boxer defeated America's idol, Joe Louis, in 1936, he was cast as Hitler's Aryan superhero. But 2 years later, Schmeling lost the rematch. He returned in disgrace to Germany and served as a paratrooper.
Max Schmeling showed up at a couple of different camps. He drove up in this enormous shiny black automobile.
They brought him in the front gate, and he walked around the camp and talked to the headquarters people.
He said, I enjoyed my fights in the United States, and you will be going home soon, and I wish I were going with you.
In the Stalags, the arrival of Allied forces signaled liberation for the long-suffering prisoners of war.
The B-17s came in from England, and we all got aboard. And when my turn came, I went right up to the nose because that's where my place was, a navigator station in the nose of the airplane.
Really feeling great. It was a wonderful moment to be back in the air and heading west.
POWs were heading home to a nation that was imprisoning its own citizens, Japanese Americans, behind barbed wire. They were finding needed comfort in the most American of games. That's next. And ahead, the tragic stories of the Montana State football players begin to unfold. The internment of Japanese Americans is not a proud chapter in United States history. It began almost immediately after Pearl Harbor with the full force of federal law and was explained to the country as a wartime necessity.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
My dad wouldn't unpack his suitcase for almost over a week because he was upset. And we were kind of downhearted too.
When I went into camp, I had this little duffel bag that my mother made for me. When we start unpacking, I had a Tony Lazzari left-handed baseball glove inside my suitcase.
Tetsu Furukawa and his family were among 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, deemed security risks by the federal government. They were ordered from their homes and businesses and herded into temporary barracks at 10 so-called relocation centers throughout the western United States.
You're American citizens, you get detained, you get incarcerated, and you get shoved into horse stables, and you think that, my God, what's happening? This is just a stench of inhumanity.
The barbed wire fence was all the way around. Stuck in a camp like that with nothing to do, we just didn't know what was going on.
After working hours, over weekends, a relocation center is the scene of baseball and softball games by the dozen.
They took everything away that was all-American to the internees, yet they didn't take away the all-American sport. Putting on a baseball uniform was like putting on the American flag. It was their badge of honor.
Japanese Americans produced scores of talented players in the 1920s and 30s, among them Kenichi Zenemura.
He played against Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and all these big-name Yankees that barnstormed Fresno.
He was only 5'1". He was very small, but very fast.
He was the father of Japanese-American baseball. He ate, breathed, and slept the game. Everywhere he went, he built a baseball stadium.
Zenemura was in his 40s and was interned with his family at the Gila River Butte Camp in Arizona. There, in the middle of the desert, he carved out a diamond and organized 32 baseball teams. Zenemura's teams became the pride of the internment camp.
Imagine a field of dreams in the middle of a Pima Indian reservation. It had a grass infield, it had a grass outfield. 7,000 people would show up to the games.
Playing for Zenemura, you had to go practice a lot. You were a better fielder, you could chase flies better, and it gave you a lot more confidence.
Zenemura's team of high school players from the Gila River camp earned a reputation beyond the camp's barbed wire. In April of 1945, they attracted the attention of the three-time defending state high school champions from Tucson.
Zenemura got a call from the coach of the Tucson High School, and they came to an agreement where they would play 2 games.
Coach Slagle relished the opportunity to play, these great ball players, whether they were Japanese Americans, whether they were internees, enemy aliens, it didn't matter to him.
Zenemura's team played their coach's scrappy brand of ball, rallying from an early deficit. The game was tied at 10 into the bottom of the 10th inning.
So the count is 3-2, the bases are loaded, and whammo, Harvey Zenemura hits a line drive over the third base. Everybody runs out to the field. It's pandemonium.
This was much more than a baseball victory. This was a humongous victory for self-esteem, for the underdogs to win.
We thought maybe we might get a return game. It didn't happen.
Letter from Tucson coach Hanley Slagle to Eagles coach Zenemura. As for the possibility of canceling our game, we'd never given it a minute's thought till we arrived home and started hearing from these so-called 100% Americans. I sincerely hope it won't be too long till we are all thinking straight again and can live together in a true democracy.
Response from Kenichi Zenemura to the members of the Tucson baseball team. I can only hope that in due time the differences in opinion can be overcome and that we may be able to resume our athletic rivalry. I sincerely hope that we may meet again, not as a team perhaps, but as single members of Uncle Sam's and fight together for one principle. Sincerely yours, Kenichi Zenemura.
The Japanese Americans would be released at war's end, though many would lose their homes or businesses. Next, as the global conflict continued in Europe and across the Pacific, the magnitude of the sacrifice of the Montana State Bobcats was only beginning to be known. The grim total alone of Montana State's sacrifice, 14 former football players made clear the dangers of wartime, and not just from combat. The first Bobcat player to die was Dana Bradford. He was a bomber pilot. In early 1942, he perished in a crash in Texas. The following year, Wendell Scobett was also killed in a training accident. By Christmas of 1943, the death toll among these players would rise to 5.
In the middle of the night comes a call, and a man says, "It's about your brother." He told me about him, and I just went to pieces. It was such a tragedy for all of us.
The Zupan family's 2 eldest sons were in combat overseas, so what happened to Al, training as a pilot in Texas, came out of the blue.
They were having war games. He was supposed to dive down and strafe the enemy, and something went wrong with the plane.
And they bailed out, and apparently he pulled the parachute cord too fast, and the parachute caught onto the airplane and took him to his death.
Losing Al was difficult for my grandmother and for my dad. I was reminded of that line where your life is a river of blood and the people who die lay down and drink from it. And I think my grandmother's river had just run dry.
When we buried Al, Mother wanted to look in there to make sure it was her son, and I had to physically restrain her. They had a write-up in the paper there that said the body was full and clean, not smashed, but I doubt that seriously.
Al Zupan was buried November 4th, 1943, in Bozeman, not far from his alma mater. 4 months later, his brother Bill shipped out for France with his infantry unit.
I had to go back. I had to put that aside and go about to what I had to do. And there's no question of me not doing it. I was a young lieutenant who had 40 young guys under me. I was very responsible for them.
Letter from Bernard Clusen, August 6, 1944. Dear Pa and all, guess you have all the hay up and are waiting for it to snow. I made Major the 30th of June, but the word didn't get here from Washington until the 1st of August. Don't work too hard. I need some of that corn on the cob for me. As ever, love, Bernard.
Bernard Clusen actually had a premonition that he would not be coming back from the war. When he was actually heading out of Bozeman to report to the Marines, he passed his best friend Max Stark on a road in Montana.
He was worried that he might not come back. He wanted me to be sure that I would take care of him if he came back crippled. So I told him I would.
In October of 1944, Clusen's father received a War Department telegram. Bernard was missing in action.
They were stationed on Kwajalein Island, as I understand. They were on a patrol mission.
There was a storm, and he was leading a flight, and the other pilots flew their planes around the storm, and Uncle Bernard didn't make it.
The plane went into the water. No one really knows whether the plane was shot up or some mechanical failure. It appears, you know, that he just didn't make it out of the airplane.
And here's his stone that they put up in memory of him when he was lost in action. His father, till his dying day, he figured that Bernard would be coming home, and which he never did.
Their whole life wasn't planned on going to war and doing this and that. They had goals in life that they never saw.
Later in 1944, Orrin Beller, a newly commissioned lieutenant, returned to Montana to see his family.
After he graduated from the officer's training and was commissioned, he got to come home. And it was a very short stay.
Well, we were all just tickled to death to see him. My chest just swelled up to think he was my brother. I remember the day he left, the bus came. We were all lined up to say goodbye to him, and he hugged my mom. He said, "Don't cry." And She tried not to.
Soon after, Orrin wrote his family with the news he had married Frances Mangum, who he had met while stationed in Mississippi. The newlyweds had only 2 weeks before Orrin's unit was deployed to France.
Letter from Orrin Beller, October 26, 1944. Dear folks, I'm 23 years old now. I'm plenty tired of this stuff and certainly want to go home. I can see how it is nerve-wracking, and enough of it would drive a guy crazy, but I never have time to think about it, and maybe I haven't enough sense to be afraid. Love, Orrin.
We didn't have a telephone, and a neighbor came over and told us there was a telegram for us, so I went down to get it. It said that Orrin was seriously wounded in France on the 13th of November, 1944.
Beller was leading his platoon in an attack on a German position when he was caught in his own supporting mortar barrage.
That was a devastating time for all of us, and my mother and my father were just absolutely broken up. My mother was just in tears all the time.
Outside the Lines, World War II, Fields of Play, Fields of Battle, is presented by State Farm Insurance. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
By the close of 1944, tragic news had come to the families of 5 more Montana State players. John Hall died in a training accident aboard his B-24 bomber in England. Joe McGeever, an Army paratrooper, was killed in combat in the south of France. Newell Berg, a Marine, died in the Pacific in the Battle of Saipan. William Coey's B-24 was lost on a mission near that same island. And in France, Orrin Beller was lying seriously wounded, his family praying for a different fate.
Letter from Orrin Beller's wife, Frances, February 19, 1945. Dearest all, I felt so sure the second message would bring us good news. Now I realize that so much can be taken from you in such a short while. Orrin was so young, so good, and I loved him so very much. The day seemed so empty now. Love to all, Frances.
I remember walking down the street and crying. And there was a boy walking across the street, and he said, "What are you crying about?" And I said, "My brother has just been killed in France."
Orrin Beller died 2 days after he was badly wounded by friendly fire.
One time when he was in France, he asked my dad if he could send him a pair of irrigation boots.
Letter from Orrin Beller. Dear folks, the weather is plenty bad. It rains every day. I hope you can get me those rubber boots I wrote about. Size 9. Love, Orrin.
My dad took him down to the post office, but it was too big a package. He took it home and he wrapped each boot separately and mailed them. After Orrin died, they sent home his trunk of things. There was only one irrigation boot in that trunk.
By the beginning of 1945, 11 former Montana State football players had died in the service of their country. The sacrifices were to continue. In February, Rick Roman was killed in action in France. 1 month later, Carl Fye was cut down near the German border. And in July, weeks from the end of the war, Alton Zempel was killed in an accident during flight training in Texas. He was the final Bobcat to enter the military and the last to give his life.
To have 11 from one team and then 3 from previous teams go completely obliterated any other school's sacrifice.
I attended a summer session at Bozeman about 1964 and saw the plaque with the names of the Golden Bobcats. It was hard to believe that all these young men had sacrificed their lives for their country.
In 1946, Montana State fielded a team comprised mainly of war veterans attending school on the new GI Bill. Among those players, Bill Zupan, the only Bobcat from the 1941 team who served in the war and returned to play football.
You can imagine the kind of unbridled joy and wonderment these guys must have felt on a football field when many of them months earlier had been shot at. It must have been a wonderful feeling.
1946 team, they enjoyed success that hadn't been seen in Montana since the late 1920s. They went to the first bowl game in the school's history, playing for the memory of their fallen comrades who died during the war.
They are remembered not merely for the grim coincidence that they were teammates, but for the sacrifice and the service that each made for his country. Just as prisoners of war hold reunions to rekindle their experiences, and Japanese Americans received both an apology and reparations for their internment, the memory of the men of the Montana State football team is an integral part of the history of our country's greatest struggle and its greatest victory. Aboard the USS Intrepid, for Outside the Lines, I'm Bob Lee.
Outside the Lines is a presentation of ESPN, the worldwide leader in sports. For more, log on to ESPN.com.